makes it beautiful the way it is, the way it looks at you, the way it lives.
Welcome to Besimply. This is Suzanne, Toro, and I want to thank you for joining us today. We have special guest Stephanie Arnold. She is a writer, producer, speaker, thought leader, and author of 37 Seconds. Today, we're going to dive into her journey and her story of following her intuition that led her to saving her life. Without further ado, let's dive in with Stephanie.
Little bit of time, 'cause beauty is as beauty does. Only some have that touch. It's hard to find, but easy to follow. Beauty is as beauty does until tomorrow.
Stephanie, I want to thank you for being here today. I'm really excited to introduce your great work. You're a writer and you're sharing a very personal story with the world, what your passion is behind sharing your story, 37 seconds of passing away and then coming back. Like, what's your deepest, like, knowing and doing that? Because that's a pretty, significant thing to happen. And then to want to share it, what's the goal there for you? What was the lead inspiration?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's about time that you and I connected, right? So I'm
Yeah.
happy. I'm really excited about that. So I when I was going through what I was going through, which we'll get into, I was Googling everything known to man about premonitions, foreboding, and those stories didn't exist in pregnancy. And at least they weren't on a Google search at the time that I had this whole thing happen to me. And so the passion that I have now is to not just educate the public, you as a patient, and listening to your intuition, whether it comes from a spiritual place or whether it comes from that we're hardwired from it. That to me is second nature. As far as the first part of it is to listen to it, because it's very real and it can ultimately save your life. And I also am educating clinicians to listen to their patients a little differently than they have been in the past. Not most, but a lot of physicians, nurses, doctors will brush off somebody's knowing, that I call it. You don't know how you know, you just do. You as an individual know your body better than anyone else. And so it's about taking action, being an advocate for yourself, and then having the clinician listen to you differently and being assured that they are hearing you.
Mm. Yeah, beautiful. What has been the feedback loop for people to you, like where they listen maybe because they heard your story or
I've had, I've been on book tours, talked on TV, and the emails that I get are people in person will say, after so many people have told you no and said this couldn't be possible and everything's fine, I would have listened to them. And I always reiterate the fact that then you would have stayed dead, because ultimately it was repeating what I believe to be true that ultimately had one physician listen and saved my life. So the feedback I've been getting is, like even on the TikTok, as you and I talked off camera, even on TikTok, I had one woman last week say, I don't even like your TikToks, but this is the vision I was having. And I woke up in a cold sweat because I have to take a flight at 6 a.m. And she's like, and I just see it crashing and I don't know what to do and everything. And I'm like, okay, well, first of all, if I had this kind of vision, and those are things, they're connecting with my story on something, that's
Right.
happened to them personally. I'm like, first of all, if you're feeling this so strongly, is there a way for you to change the flight? If there's a way for you to change the flight, then I would do it, because it's keeping you awake. It's incessant. It's not fading. And second of all, why don't you like my TikToks? So I'm like, so she's like, I know that came out wrong, but ultimately she made the decision to not take the flight and drove instead. And she said that feeling of doom just subsided, but she had heard on the news that a plane had crashed around the time that her flight took off, not knowing whether it was her flight or not, but it was, maybe she was feeling that from some other flight, but it was enough to calm her down. And I always say, I'm like, you'll never regret speaking up and being wrong.
Yeah.
People are going to judge you. People thought I was crazy. People thought, okay, let this woman just have this baby and move on. But in the event you are right, it is not worth staying quiet if it's going to save your life. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, she definitely then was picking up on. I saw that woman. I was curious because I was trying to find out. She was definitely picking up on a plane crash and then associating, because we're two-way radios. So we're like a dolphin or a whale. We all are two-way radios. So we have this thing called the pineal gland between both hemispheres that is always engaging. We're just not aware of it because of the world that we live in as much. So I applaud you for listening to your
Yeah,
own.
but then how do you differentiate between what's going to happen to you in that flight versus what's going to happen to somebody else in that flight? And, in this instance, it's not like you can call every airline and every, hub and say there's going to be a crash this morning because the FBI is going to be investigating you. But what do you do to differentiate that this is not happening to you versus happening to something else?
Well, it's a practice, really, like to learn and to listen, what's yours and what's not. People that are very empathic, they can feel other people's emotions, and they have to learn, is this my anxiety or stress, or is that someone else? Was I one way or different? Same with messages like that. So, and I think your advice, if it's incessant, that's really, like, I would say, the universe, God, divine, saying, hello, we need you to pay attention to this. So yeah, absolutely. And you never know what she could have intercepted on the way to getting on the plane. So it could have all just been correlated to her missing something that she was associating with the plane crash, but that was the mile marker to, like, get her to pay attention. Yeah.
At the end of the day, she's fine. It subsided. She drove. It was probably an inconvenience for a few hours, but she's alive. She's calmer, and nothing happened on the flight. Maybe I don't know. But to me, I'm like, okay, that's peace of mind. I would
Absolutely.
rather react by talking about what I feel is about to happen, move people out of the way, and nothing happen, than me not to do something and then prove that I'm right, that something happens, and then say, shit, I saw
Right.
this, it happened. Okay, now why didn't I do anything?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, share with the listeners your story. They can read it in 37 seconds, correct? But if you don't want to totally spoil it, share it in a way that people can understand your experience.
Yeah, so thank you. So I met my husband in 2008. He relocated me from LA from a really productive TV career, because I worked in reality television for most of my career, and moved from LA to Chicago. And that's pretty much where my career ended. And then we started, he had a child from a previous relationship. And so we wanted our own. And I had the first child, Adina, after 3 rounds of IVF. So some complications, but in the scheme of things, not really. The only real complication I had with her during the birth was that she was too big and I ended up needing a C-section. And then with the second one, Jacob, I got pregnant with him on my 7th round of IVF, and everything went swimmingly for the first 20 weeks. Everything was great. My husband is an economist and expert witness, and he was chosen to be the chief economist for the New York Attorney General's office. So very science-brained, PhD, University of Chicago, former Air Force pilot. So you get the type. We're splitting our time between New York and Chicago. And at the 20-week ultrasound, I'm diagnosed with a placenta previa. And I don't know what that is, but in the moment that the doctor tells us this, I look at my husband, and I had this sinking feeling, and I said, I don't know what this is, but I'm already special in the category of my blood type, which is O negative, which is 7% of the population. I said, I don't want to be special in any other category. And he's like, honey, you need to relax. It's totally fine. You're getting great prenatal care. We don't even know. We'll get all the information. And so we get home and I start Googling, obviously, what a placenta previa is. And it's basically where the placenta is growing on top of the cervix. And, as the belly grows, as the uterus grows, it should take over, move out of the way. But in the event it doesn't, the likelihood of a C-section is a little higher. And, it's like, okay, it's, that's not a big deal. I've had a C-section before, that I'm not afraid of the unknown. But then I kept reading. And it said a placenta previa can turn into an accreta, which is what Kim Kardashian had, which is where the placenta marries itself to the uterus. If that happens, it could cause some bleeding. If that happens, you might deliver prematurely. If that happens, you might hemorrhage. If that happens, you might need a hysterectomy. And if that happens, you and the baby could lose your lives. And I sat back and I call it a knowing. Like, you don't know how you know, you just do. It is, whether one wants to call it, you're hearing it from outside of yourself. I have my own belief system on all of this, but I heard it loud and clear. And I looked at my husband and I said, this is going to happen to us. The only difference is the baby's going to be fine, but I'll be dead on the operating table. So he looks at it. He's like, okay, honey, what you're afraid of happening is a half a percent chance of happening. That's never going to happen. And I'm like, but he's not listening to me. And I'm like, but I know this is going to happen. So I can't talk to somebody left brain when you're right brain and you're spiritual and he is not. So, what do? I start telling everybody. I tell friends, I tell, doctors, I tell nurses, I said, this, and this is going to happen. Placenta previa to turn to a accreta, need a hysterectomy. You're going to need extra blood. Who do I talk to that when I need a hysterectomy? Like, all of these things, everybody thought I was crazy. And in their defenses, I had lots of tests and all the tests were negative for what I was afraid of happening. So, there were times, and I write about this book, there were times that I was, taking my daughter in a stroller and she was 2 at the time, or a little under 2. And it was winter, so the fountain was dry. And so I was explaining how it's so beautiful when the fountain is running. And all of a sudden, in my mind's eye, the fountain started spurting blood. And I had a visceral reaction to it. Like, my blood was draining from my body and I felt like I was hemorrhaging. So I called my husband. I said, meet me in the ER. We go to the ER. They're like, Mrs. Arnold, are you okay? I'm like, no, obviously I'm hemorrhaging. And I'm wearing black leggings. It's winter. I'm afraid if I take off the leggings and, I'm going to lose the baby. And they're like, you're fine. Everything's fine. Amniotic fluid's fine. Everything's okay. And my husband says, okay, great. It's a false alarm. And I'm like, no, this is a warning. It was so clear about what was going to happen. So I met with, I was told that if I needed a hysterectomy during childbirth, that my OB couldn't do the procedure, that I would be transferred to maternal fetal medicine. But you don't want an MFM to do it. You want a gynecological oncologist to do it, because they have more experience with high risk reproductive organ surgeries. And when 20% of your blood supply is going to the uterus, you want a gynoc to do it. So I made an appointment with the head of gynoc at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Now, mind you, teaching hospital, 12,000 babies a year, I am batshit crazy going to make an appointment in this waiting room while women are actually suffering from cancer. And my husband gets to the waiting room and he sees these women with IVs in their arm, no hair on their heads. He's like, I'm embarrassed to be here. And I said, I don't know what to tell you. Maybe this doctor has heard of a patient having this level of foreboding and he can give me some sort of homework to do. There's something different because they are aware at a very deep level. Maybe I have some form of cancer. I have no idea.
Yeah.
And so we're in the meeting room with him, his resident, so the doctor that's head of gynec, Dr. Shing, his resident, Dr. Hill Park, my husband and I in this little, waiting room, or this little conference room. And he's like, how can I help you, Ms. Arnold? And I said, my placenta previa is going to turn into an accreta. I'm going to need a hysterectomy at the time of my delivery. And now I see you, you see me. My husband was like, it's very mafia-like. I see you, you see me, you're my doctor, right? So I said, you're my doctor. And, that's it. And he looks at me, the resident stops writing. It's the moment in a sitcom. And he sits back and he says, Mrs. Arnold, have you been on the internet? And I was like, why, yes, I have, doctor, but this is going to happen. And he's like, okay, well, let's get an MRI. If the MRI is positive for an accreta, then I'll schedule myself the day of your mandatory C-section at 37 weeks. And we'll take care of it then. I said, okay. And I felt better because I had something to do that was a little bit more invasive, less, troublesome for the child, but more, maybe I could get more information. So we do the MRI. The MRI is negative for an accreta. And my husband says, you should feel better. And I said, I feel worse because I'm running out of people to tell this crazy foreboding story to. So I have a call with anesthesia. Anesthesia tells me, this is where you'll have an epidural. This is where you recover. This is, these things. I said, I know that, but what happens if this, and this happens? I try one last time. And she said, Ms. Arnold, we're in a teaching hospital. We prepare for all sorts of emergencies. I hope I made you feel better. And she said, she'll never forget the last words I said to her. She said, I told her, it is what it is. So I hung up with her, and then her name was Dr. Grace Lim. And I hung up with her and I took to Facebook. I said, if anybody has my blood type, I'm going to need it. Mind you, I'm way off the rails. Like at this point, anybody trying to convince me otherwise that like trying to say the data is showing this is going to happen, I wasn't listening to any of it. I mean, this woman saw me in Starbucks and she was pregnant. She was like, oh, how's the pregnancy going? I'm like, I'm going to die. Very matter of fact. I mean, my friends stayed away from me. My family was like, call us when you deliver the baby. Like, and I understand in hindsight, but they didn't see what I was feeling.
Right.
So 36 weeks to the day, Jonathan's out of town and I start bleeding on the kitchen floor and I'm like, it's time. So I call him, he gets on a plane and starts heading back to Chicago. And I'm in the hospital and, my doctor says, Stephanie, you've been stressed this whole pregnancy. I think it's time. The ORs are quiet. Let's go ahead and take Jacob. And my daughter is there and, I kiss her a million times and I'm like, she's never going to remember me. I'm typing on Skype chat at the time to my husband. I'm like, please know you've made me the happiest woman in the world. Please, this child is not to blame for this. Please love our children. I mean, I don't remember everything that I said. And then he still wasn't getting it. He said, where do I meet you? And I said, 8th floor recovery, hopefully. And then they wheeled me down and I broke down crying. And I told my doctor, I'm like, you need to put me under general anesthesia. She said, Stephanie, I put you under general anesthesia. I put the baby to sleep. It's too dangerous. I know you're nervous because Jonathan's not here. I promise you we're here. We'll take care of you. And that's it. Cause what am I going to do? I can't run away from this. I know I'm being wheeled into the room that is going to give life to my son. And I'm 100% sure it's going to take mine. Mm-hmm. So I get set up for a C-section. If you're not familiar with this, a curtain is in front of your face and your arms are in a T and you have, your epidural, you have everything in it, and then everything gets eerily quiet. And they deliver a happy and healthy baby. And seconds later, I'm dead. I ended up having a very, very rare pregnancy complication called an amniotic fluid embolism, which is a 1 in 40,000 risk where amniotic cells get into the mother's bloodstream. And if you happen to be allergic to it, your body goes into somewhat of an anaphylactic shock. And in most cases, you don't make it. At the time, Northwestern had been around for about 30 years. They delivered 12,000 babies a year. They had 10 in their history. 6 did not make it, and the other 3 were in permanent vegetative states. So it did not look good. The first phase of an amniotic fluid embolism is cardiac arrest, and that's where I flatlined. But there were a couple things in the OR that I didn't predict. The first being that there's a crash heart right there, and they were able to resuscitate me and intubate me 37 seconds later. And then the second phase of an AFE starts, which is called DIC, which is your body's inability to clot blood. Anesthesiologists nickname it death is coming. And mind you, I am O negative, 7% again in the population. I can only receive O negative blood. And so there was extra blood in the OR. Normal C-section, they probably have about 6 units of blood. There was extra units of blood supplied. And later I found out that anesthesiologist, that very last phone call I made, she said she was uncomfortable that I'd had a baby before, had had a C-section before, had sought out specialists to save my life. And I was so very specific about the things that I saw that she was uncomfortable and flagged my file and incorporated those extra measures that saved my life. So your normal body has 20 units of blood. I was given 60 units of blood and blood product to save my life. And so at that point, they stabilized me and they put me in the surgical ICU in a medically induced coma. And that's when Jonathan arrived. So Jonathan learned from the anesthesiologist what had happened. The anesthesiologist said, do yourself a favor, don't look it up because it doesn't look good if you research it. And then he said, if she needs a hysterectomy, this is the doctor we met with 2 months before. And the anesthesiologist thought that was odd, but she took note of it. And she said, she's stable now. Hopefully we got everything stabilized. And Jonathan went to the surgical ICU and saw me there. And 7 hours later, the machines, the bells and the whistles started going off, and turned out that I was not stable, that I was still bleeding. So they called in Dr. Schenk to perform the hysterectomy. The pathology on the uterus showed that an accreta had started to form, but where the MRI was at the time it was, whether it was too early or whatever it was not detected. And so then, you're in a coma, you're waiting. My kidneys fell offline. Everything was Armageddon on my body. And Jonathan is left holding a, 4-day-old, 5-day-old, 6-day-old, having to be a parent to 2 other girls. And on day 6, they extubated me to see where I was because they couldn't tell, even though I had full oxygenation. They were just not sure, what kind of neurological deficit there would be. And when they took me down, I was still severely edemic. And we looked down at my swollen belly, and I was like, I'm still fucking pregnant. And Jonathan was like, I think she's gonna be okay. So 1, I knew where I was, and 2, I was cursing. So he was like, all right, we've got it's there.
She's back.
And then, then going through the recovery, it took a long time. But the biggest question I had throughout my recovery was, how did I know? How did I know?
Yeah.
And the doctors would do their rounds, every department on me from nephrology to hematology to cardiology to, gynecology, everybody was like, how did you know? And I'm like, you tell me, I'm in a teaching hospital. And they're like, well, foreboding exists prior to a cardiac arrest or an embolus, but months before in the detail you had it. I'm sorry. And so they were like, and they're like, those happen moments before, maybe a day before, you feel like, just a feeling foreboding, but no. And so then, so one doctor, she was like, I think you need to go spiritual on this one. That was not comfortable because I needed something tangible to hold on to for me. Because the hardest part of this, and I continue to get premonitions, but the hardest part of this is being reliant on the spiritual stuff, the things that you cannot see, but you can feel. So those of us that have not been in tune with it prior, or have been, and just choose to ignore it because we're like, that's not real.
Right.
If I had chosen to ignore it, the psychology behind it for me was like, I could have stayed dead.
Right. Yeah.
And that is had been too much of a burden to bear.
Yeah.
And so I go on this journey, and I go to different therapists. They're like, how can we help you? I said, you can tell me how it is. I saw everything ahead of time. And they're like, let's just worry about getting you out of the trauma. And I'm like, yes, see, this is a problem I have, because one doctor said it's self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, I manifested this.
Oh,
And I said, so you believe that I could manifest my organs combining need a hemorrhage and need a hysterectomy? They're like, well, I didn't say we believe it, but it's the only thing we can come up with. I said, well, that's an asshole thing to say, because I'm
Yeah.
already thinking that I manifested this and could have taken myself away from my family. So, and I told therapist, said, what happens if I think that I'm going to have a heart attack? That I'm going to have a heart attack? I said, now I have an issue. So I ended up seeing a regression therapist, and regression therapy uses hypnotherapy to take you back into moments of trauma. And I wasn't too optimistic about this, I've got to tell you, but there was nothing traditional about our story. So why do I think traditional therapy would have helped? And I'm too type A, if you couldn't figure that out by now, to be hypnotized. So I'm like, whatever. So then I'm like, all right, I'll give it a chance. So I ended up videotaping my therapy, because, this type A personality wasn't going to have somebody hypnotize me and then I'd be clucking like a chicken every time somebody said hello,
yeah.
or what if I didn't remember anything?
That's smart.
Right. So I'm like, it wasn't my TV background that recorded it. It was me saying, I can't remember what I had for breakfast. I want to remember this, if this is going to be helpful, if she's going to give me exercises to do. So it took probably 30 sessions to get me back into the OR. And by the time she did, the video is quite graphic, where you see my body convulse and seize. And then I explain what happened after I flatlined, and what I saw the doctors doing, and who hit the button for the code, and what nurse jumped on my chest to give me CPR, what my doctors were doing. I mean, it was so detailed in 3D. And then, and she also asked, she's like, do you want to know anything about past lives? I'm like, no, because I can't, I have no way of proving if that's true or not, unless I speak a completely different language fluently to say, okay, this is something valid. But I'm like, that's not going to help me. I'm like, I just want to remember 37 seconds. And I also want to remember, like, what was I missing during those 3 months I was seeing everything around me? What was somebody sending me messages? What was going on? And that's, I'll leave that as the hint in the book, because I do come to those conclusions, but all of it ultimately, what ended up happening was, I had these tapes, I explain what happens, and Jonathan takes a quick look at it and he's like, how do you know this isn't a recalled episode of Grey's Anatomy in your head? Yeah. So he, I was like, okay, after I was done calling him a lot of names, I said, all right, it's a fair point.
Yeah.
So I go back to the therapist, say, how do you know what I'm telling you is real?
Right.
And she says, sometimes the only validation we get is the patient feels better and you feel better. And I said, that's not good enough for me. I have witnesses. So luckily I had it on tape, and I took it back to the doctors who were present. And if any of your audience is interested, we're on a Netflix series called Surviving Death. And in episode 1, 30 minutes in, you'll hear one of my doctors describe that moment, about what it was and how life altering it was for her. So I take the tapes to the doctors who are present. They're like, I didn't go to medical school for this. I'm like, this is accurate down to where we're standing, what we're doing. I mean, there were so many details to the story that it was impossible for me to know, things that wouldn't be in my medical files, things nobody would have told me. And I was unconscious, or in what you believe, a different state of consciousness, and what I believe as well. And so this whole, and then, I saw spirits, I saw hundreds and hundreds of spirits. And so that whole experience, understanding that life exists outside of the body, that consciousness exists outside of the body, that we are energy, that we just transition from one to another, has changed my whole world.
Oh, yeah.
That's my story in a nutshell.
Yeah. Well, I'm proud of you for listening to yourself. As we were talking a little bit about Tibetan traditions, and the reason in Tibetan Buddhist traditions, they have it's a science. Like they, as much as their spiritual practice, they actually have very rigorous studies through math, science, physics. Your husband would love it because it like complements both sides of the brain.
Yeah.
And so nothing's to be, and the reason for that is the training from the unseen to the seen world. So when you're getting closer to your death gateway, it starts to appear. So you are having the understanding, clear knowing of what was going to happen. Your fate was to save yourself. So I think that's really beautiful. And now,
yeah, no, I have that conversation with Jonathan all the time. It's like, well, if it's predetermination of when you're going to die, then where does free will fit into it? I said, let me explain. I said, I have an answer for you. I said, I believe they're on two separate paths. I said, maybe it was always in my cards I was going to survive, but how well I survived was due to my free will.
absolutely.
And so I'm not free willing my way to life. I'm free willing my life as a survivor and how well I survived. So, so that definitely, we were in Bhutan, a few years ago, and we went to different different Buddhist temples, and we went to Tiger's Nest. If you've ever been, I don't know.
I haven't, but I know where it is.
So we were at Tiger's Nest, and this monk took us up there, and it was quiet before the visitors came, and there was a quiet area in this temple. And I said, do you mind if I meditate over here? And he's like, no. He's like, do you mind if I sit with you? And I said, no. So, when people, I've been told, when people go to Buddhist temples, you can actually feel the pain from what they're shedding. And they're suffering in this lifetime or not suffering in this lifetime because they're shedding it, in awaiting the next lifetime. Right. And so we're meditating, and I feel it all hit me. And I feel it in a way that, like, I'm tearing, and this monk looks at me. I said, do you want to feel something? I said, I'll take it back. But I said, and I don't know what I'm doing. It's almost like it's almost like an out of body experience, but I feel intuitively like I'm okay and I'm grounded. And he puts his hand over mine with that. And I said, I just want you to feel what I feel, but I will take it back because you don't need to feel it. So he puts his hand over mine, and he feels like this ball of heavy energy. And then I pull it back, and he looks at me, and then, I release it, and he has said, and he knows nothing about my story. And he is like, you're a doll. And I said, what is that? He said, somebody who's died and come back into their own body. And he says, you have work to do. And I was like, you're freaking me out. I'm going to go off this mountain and I'm going to go get some lunch. Right. So I was like, but when I think I'm like, oh, I'm so in control and I'm okay, then somebody throws me, a left hook. I'm like, just knocks me off of everything. And I'm like, it's just so odd. And this is just like second nature. I spent a lot of time with Taoist priests in China at Wudang Mountain, and meditating for like 18 hours a day and climbing 8,000 steps to this golden temple. And intuition to them is a sixth sense, but it's not the seventh sense. And I'm like, what's that? So it's like, these are things that are second nature to them. And we're still discovering the fact that, we can sense empathically things.
Yeah. Beautiful. So where has that taken you on your road? Like, we touched on a little bit, but you saying, I don't want to know some of these things, but what doors have opened for you since that you're more, an advocate for people listening to themselves beyond their rational mind? What else has opened up for you?
I think everybody has their own quote unquote missions or their own callings in life and their own experiences. I don't think it's a coincidence that I've worked in TV most of my career, that when the most important story there was to tell was the one that happened to me that can help affect and save lives. So that it's clear in that respect, and not in an egotistical way. It's more of like, okay, this is happening. I'm a witness to it. And if I have any gift is the fact that there's no filter. So it comes out And so there's witnesses around so they can say, okay, this Stephanie is not this medium,
Yeah.
asking you for money to do readings. This is something catastrophic that ignited something. And I do believe traumas do ignite this kind of superpower, if you will, if intuition is considered that. And with that, in my opinion, just comes a lot of responsibility in sharing your story and inserting yourself into a narrative that will help validate others that might not have as many witnesses, or other people think they're crazy. So now when you Google premonitions during pregnancy or for weight, my story will come up and they can be like, hey, I might be feeling something you might not know. And then they can have the conversation with a doctor and say, hey, I'm feeling this. I know the data is not showing any of this, but I keep feeling this. And so instead of brushing somebody off and saying, oh, they're batshit crazy, or saying that they're anxious or histrionic or neurotic, they can listen differently and you can advocate for yourself differently. So whereas it taken me, I speak at a lot of hospitals, institutions. I've even spoken at the Department of Defense. I've spoken at investment companies that want to learn more, because nobody learns business from me. What they're learning is the HR, the human side of things, of how these CEOs are dealing with their family and their staff, about going with their gut on things, not just the data. They don't need me for research on their data. What they need, what they need to hear is that, hey, maybe their wife was right about the person that they hired, and that person has turned into one big cluster. And even though he looked good on paper, or she looked good on paper, it wasn't the best thing for you or this family or the company. And so it just puts into question all these things that maybe that should be as valid and as important, just like Steve Jobs talks about intuition, just like, a lot of, Oprah talks about it, that a lot of people talk about, like, maybe we should lean in a little differently. And I'm just nobody. I'm just this average person that had a really crazy, crazy experience. So anybody else who considers themselves average, normal, whatever that is, when they have these experiences, maybe they can say, hey, I'm not alone in this, because it sure as hell felt like I was alone going through it.
Yeah. Question. I your son's popping into my mind. Uh, how was he his first like 4 or 5 years, like as far as what he shared with you, like on a soul level or spirit level, however you want to refer to it?
When he was really, so he's 9 now, but when he was really young, you could see a light following him. He'd sit in the classroom and the sunlight would hit and it would hit on him directly, or, there was something that you could just feel and see about an aura. Like you could just experience it. He's a very gifted piano player. He's very articulate. He's been speaking since he was extremely young, in the months old. Um, and very empathic, like, for family night, even like for back to school this past week, he was the only kid in his class that wrote a note to his parents saying, I love you, have a good time. And, like, he was just very sensitive and compassionate towards others and his family. The older he gets, he's trying to ground himself. And I don't think at this age, I don't think it's deliberate, but he'll be questioning, like, his friends or family know about my book or have watched it on Netflix and be like, come on, your mother didn't die, because if she died, she'd stay dead. And then I have to explain what clinical death means and asystole and all these things. And I'm like, it's too much for his age. But he's like, mommy, can you explain to me this? Because this doesn't make sense. So he's trying to then be the Jonathan, right? He's trying to work the engineering side in his mind, the mathematical equation of how it's possible. But things surprised him. Like we're looking at a house in a completely different state. And this was a month ago. And we walk into this. Now we saw, I'd say 25 houses. We walk into this house and he's like, Mike, this is our house. And I was like, okay, well, I don't know where you get the money that you think that you're going to buy this house, because it's too out of our price range. And so he's like, it's our house. And I was like, okay, fine. It's a nice house, but we're not buying it. So we leave, like a weekend goes by. And I tell Jonathan, I said, you know what? I'd like to go back to that house. I think there's 3 houses I want to see and just compare our notes. And we walk into the same house and it's Jacob. It's always Jacob. Jacob walks into the kitchen. He says, Mommy, look what's on the kitchen counter. Now there's a stack of like a magazine and, a National Geographic and a book on whatever it was, and 37 seconds. And when I tell you, like, he saw it across the room, it was sandwiched between, like, he just was zoned right in. So I go to the broker. I said, do you know how the owner knows this book? And she's like, what's the significance of the book? I said, I wrote it. And she said, I just got chills. I said, so did I. I said, and meanwhile, I have my husband next to me who's saying, honey, they called you into the gate last week. They probably Googled you, bought the book. That's it. It's end deal. And then he's off looking at other things in the house. And I said, he's probably right. He's probably right. And then I got a call from the broker saying she had no idea it was the same person. She bought the book a couple of weeks ago. And she also has no idea why she put it that day in the kitchen because she read it a while ago.
It is chills.
And so I look at Jacob and I'm like, well, house not ours yet, but maybe it's still on the market and maybe it might be later. But yeah, it's like, and I posted something about it and everybody's like, welcome home. I look at that as a significant sign. So don't know. I'll go with your gut.
Go with your gut. Well, the reason I was asking about your was in utero with you. And
Right.
so you had a world, you have another soul inside you. Most women can attest they feel very different from the time they get pregnant sometimes.
I absolutely worry about the fact that, all of that feeling of foreboding had some level of effect on him. So I've been hyper vigilant about watching.
I was actually going in another direction. Counsel people of all faiths. So from Christianity to one life model to reincarnation model. I would say that your son assisted in helping you with that knowing because his soul has come from someplace else. So people in a Christian faith might say from God or heaven. From a reincarnation model, it would mean that he just left another life and has entered into your womb for his next life. The soul doesn't lose its, it doesn't become a baby when it goes in the womb. It's still omnipresent. It has the ability to see, hear, feel. It's a similar, like how some of the things maybe you experienced when you crossed over, if you flatlined, you start to see your subconscious picked up on those, even if your conscious mind didn't retain them. So that's why I was curious to ask, because he would have helped in the process, and you have some indicators that he's intuitive also.
Yeah, he did. He said, I think when he was 4, when he looked at me like going to sleep, and he's like, I read him a story and said goodnight, and he's like, Mommy, I chose you. And I was like, huh? He's like, yeah. He's like, I know you needed a son and I needed you as my mom. And I was like, great. How explain this one to your father? And so, and Adina definitely has certain moments where, she obviously, I think she was at school, and I don't talk about this a lot, but she was in 2nd grade, I think, 2nd grade. And, you're in the halls and you're saying hi to your teachers you had in kindergarten or whatever. And, she would hug this kindergarten almost every day. She loved her so much. And the kindergarten teacher sent me an email. She's like, I figured you want to know this. And she said, so, Dia says hi to me every day. And she said, today she looked down and she's like, oh, you're having a baby. And she says, Stephanie, I'm 4 days pregnant. No one knows I'm pregnant. Yeah. So I read the email to Jonathan. He's like, well, shit. What are you trying to tell me? He's like, well, what am I living with a bunch of witches now? And I was like no. So he was like, yeah. So we definitely, I said, look, and I went to Adina. I said, how did you know she was pregnant? And she said, I felt the head.
Beautiful. Yeah. So my daughter did a similar thing when Merrick, who I lost, she stood in front of me and said, hi, baby. before we even had taken a pregnancy test.
Wow.
So how has your husband come along with all this process? Because I'm not like it's available to the whole wide world. How has he opened up his eyes and ears and senses?
He hasn't, but what he has done is that he says he understands that I'm able to see certain things. He trusts it more. If I say something, he will yield now. And he is like, I don't have the patience or the bandwidth or the mental acuity to go down this rabbit hole with you to try and figure out how this all works. But he said, I do believe that you can sense these things. And so that he's changed. He does have faith in God. We're Jewish. And so he definitely practices at a different level than he did before. But I can't say that I'd say he's a hopeful agnostic now, if you will.
Yeah. Hopeful agnostic. I love that.
So I'd say that, but he's not, when I sense something like that's happening in my body or what have you, he's like, okay, let's go to the doctor. Like he wants backups, but he knows that not all tests are accurate and there's margin of error. So he goes back to, science to say, I can't believe all the tests were wrong, but
that happens. And luckily you were vigilant, like you had a deep knowing, and kept yourself prepared. So for you, having created this into something that's digestible into a book on Netflix, what is next for you? Like as far as what is the God universe showing you to walk next?
I keep seeing this as a movie. I wrote the screenplay to keep it, even though I get rejected. I'm like, I wrote the screenplay. It's in play now with a very big producer. Who knows? These things get optioned and never, but I see it. So maybe it's wishful thinking, but I see it. And then with the Netflix people, I developed a podcast called Knowing. So I want to tell other people's stories just to give more of the audience and understanding that this runs deep and we're not alone. It runs deep with a ton of things, from danger lurking ahead to seeing death, to feeling other people's pain, but at a level that it's entertaining, it's shocking, they're credible sources, they're just that everybody realizes that this is possible. And all of it does not have a scientific explanation. Because believe me, I'm down this rabbit hole. I keep going down it. I do.
Yeah. Well, I'm really proud of you for creating a voice and, having the courage to, you made a really valuable point that, your fate was this experience and you met it in a ways. And I share this with my clients a lot, like we have destined points in our life. And do you want to show up fully juiced up or do you want to be depleted? And you put your A game on so that you could meet that moment with all things being met just by listening to your knowing. So thank you for that. I think should be a really good example for people. One other thing before we exit out, after this experience, you got motivated to bodybuild, which I remember Larry, our mutual friend, sharing this too. What was the motivation for that? I think it's amazing. But, was it to be grounded in your body, like reconnect with your physical body, or where was the inspiration?
So you're one of the few people that understand it, because I can explain it and then not fully go through it. The first reason really was out of frustration, because I had this massive scar down the center. I was in Bhutan. I was meditating. Like I was spiritually grounded, if you will. But I was unhappy physically because I was mourning the loss of my womanhood and everything that I lost
Yeah.
prior. And I don't think I really ever mourned the moment of, if you hear interviews in the past, you'll hear, oh, and I died for 37 seconds, and then I move on to the next topic. I don't really, I'm like, I never wanted to feel it. And somebody made mention of that one time. And as I went through this kind of metamorphosis, if you will, I was like, maybe I'm just holding on to too much. Every time I do acupuncture on that scar, I break down crying. And I'm like, I need to be tethered. Like I was having a hard time grounding. And so they talk about like, even in books like Eat, Pray, Love and like the mind, body, soul, here it was, the mind was functioning to help save the soul, but the body was in complete turmoil. And healthy I was getting. However, with menopause and me complaining constantly, everybody would say, Stephanie, look at what you've been through. It's okay. You've had babies, you've had your body hacked up. It's okay. And I've never been one to just be like, it's okay. Either you stop complaining and you live with it, or you do something about it and you make it better. And so I kind of did the latter because I was like, I can't stand hearing myself bitch anymore about the physical.
Yeah.
So I'm a total immersion kind of person. I'm like, and also short term. I'm like, what is the fastest way? There was no way I could do plastic surgery because of all the trauma. I would have lost blood supply, belly button. I wasn't going under the knife for
Yeah.
all reasons. So I was like, everything I kept reading was this bikini bodybuilding competition. And it was 16 weeks of diet exercise. And I'm like, okay, you know what? If I do anything for 16 weeks, it's going to change. And at least I can have a focus. Somebody's telling me what to eat. Somebody's telling me what to do. And then I was like, okay, it wasn't easy. My father died in between this process, but it was what my brain could handle. And I never expected the results that I had from this process because your audience can't see what I looked like then or back then, but on TikTok, I've done a couple of things which you can see where my body was before I started. And if you would have told me I could get the body that that I have now with all of the trauma, I would have been like, you're absolutely crazy. So it's really, it helped create a stronger physique that resembles the warrior that's inside of
Mm.
that
Oh,
body. And I remember Dallas Gray saying one time, they're like, if your soul doesn't like, you have to keep your body as a 5-star temple. If you, or 5-star hotel, if you do not, your soul could just find its own 5-star hotel. And so that it's a funny little thing that he used to say, but I was like, I have felt, for your audience, it'll be fine, but for any other audience, it would not be. But I have felt what hitchhikers feel like, hitchhiking souls. I have felt like when you have 60 people's blood and tissue and energy infused into your body, what that feels like when you're coming out of it and how different your soul moves over and everything else takes over. And one can say this is the medication, the trauma, but I believe that through all of that energy that's, immediately infused into your body, it's like it does something to your soul. And so now I feel like, okay, the body is stronger. I'm 51 now. And so you think about like what osteoporosis can do in the future. You push that all off by doing this. So I'm happy it started, but this would have never happened without going through everything that I went through. And then in addition to be able to share with the audience, yeah, it's never too late to start this. And this isn't a weight loss program. I'm not here saying, oh, okay, let's join a weight loss program. I'm just saying like it's possible. So all these moms that are telling me, I've had 3 children, I've had IVF and everything. I'm like, I hear you. I've also had that, and I've had kidney failure, and I've flatlined, and I've had this and that. He said, but you can tell somebody else that. I completely understand because I did it for years. But there is a way to do it if you want to do it.
well, 2 things. The Taoist priests, to your feeling of we're electromagnetic fields. So, which you very much, I felt when you came back into your body, the electromagnetic surge of you re-entering. So everything that we touch or feel or whatever, we leave an electromagnetic imprint. So for certain, having all those energies come together to put you back together would have an impact. So I applaud you for even assimilating to that, because I know working as an integrative specialist at times, Western medicine does not account for that. They don't even know how to speak to that. And even some of the Eastern art they kind of slough over it. So I'm really proud of you. And the other part, do you feel like the bodybuilding really helped your mental state of being also? Just like bringing it all together again.
I think so, because I feel like, well, first of all, it empowered me. Like, I'm doing this myself. Like, there's no doctor that's in charge of this body. This is me doing so. And it's not for everybody. People have limitations with things. And I totally understand that. But for me, I was like, if I'm going to be in pain, I'd rather be in pain from lifting weights and seeing the body transform and seeing a goal. And I'm goal oriented. So there was a linear goal. It helped me feel like I could present a message being stronger physically than the same message when I was weaker physically. Because when I would get on stage and I would speak, I'd be flattened afterwards. Like, there was no protection. And there were grounding exercises like you obviously, share and teach. But I didn't fully believe that this all had a spiritual explanation. So while I'm in search of it, I'm like, oh, I'll still give a speech. And then I get hit and knocked down with 1,000 people's energy. And I'm like, I'll see you next Tuesday. Because I'm like, there's no way that I'm going to be able to get up from this bed. And then I'm questioning, why is that? So I feel like the strength that I've given the body gives me, when I'm not fully prepared to ground, like if I take a 1-2 punch, it's like I can get back up a little easier than I could before when I was weaker, for sure.
Good. Well, you're amazing. You're a bright light of inspiration on so many fronts, for all of us out there that have met adversity. So I thank you for your great work.
Thank you.
Share with the audience where they can connect to your Netflix segment. We'll put the links below, but I always feel like it's good for you to orate where they can find you.
So on the website, it has a lot of the information. So it's stephaniearnold.net, N-E-T. And then on TikTok, it's Stephanie Arnold 37, or on Instagram, it's Steph Arnold 37. But it's anywhere. You can find it pretty much. I mean, easily findable.
Perfect. All right. Well, I thank you for being.
Once again, I want to thank all of you and Stephanie Arnold for being here today. As inspired, please support her great work by purchasing her book or gifting it to someone you love, and watching her segment on the Netflix film series entitled Surviving Death. All the links are below. And we're going to exit out with a little Kadri Scott, Beauty Is. And Stephanie, you truly are a beauty to all of us. Thank you for spreading awareness, knowing, and your bright light.
What makes it beautiful? The way it is, the way it looks at you, the way it lives, the way it feels, the way it gives, the way you call it mine and grasp onto it. But if ill-intended, true beauty will fade. Can't be manufactured, not man-made. It's brewed in the soul like a fine wine, with a little bit of love and a little bit of time. 'Cause beauty is as beauty does. Only some have that touch. It's hard to find, but easy to follow. Beauty is as beauty does until tomorrow. Ooh, What makes it beautiful? The way you love, each their own. If you find it, hold it and don't let go. Hard to find, but easy to follow. Beauty is as beauty does until tomorrow.
Until next time, this is Suzanne signing out. With a full heart, a soft gaze, a deep bow, and a namaste. Be simply.